Welcome to Whistleblower Network News. I am your host, Jane Turner, FBI whistleblower and advocate. It is our honor to share with you these experiences of real life heroes and people of integrity. Welcome to Whistleblower of the Week. And today I'm very excited to have on an international whistleblower, Jonathan Taylor. I was over in England recently and working with Georgina Halford Hall and met Jonathan, who is inspiring. He's incredible in what he's done. He's suffered, and he is an incredible whistleblower. Welcome, Jonathan. It's great to have you on Whistleblower of the Week.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Now, I want to tell our audience a little bit about you in particular. Where were you born? And tell us a little bit about your parents that formed you.
I was born in Southampton in the UK, in the county of Hampshire. So that's the south coast, pretty much in the middle, just above that island called the Isle of Wight. Born in June 1969 to Robert and Hazel Taylor. So my father, he was taken away quite early when I was 23 in 1992. Unfortunately, he had leukemia. Before then, he was a travel agent working for the now pretty much defunct Thomas Cook. Worked in Southampton High Street most of his life, right there. Was a very good salesman, did very well in his position. My late mother, she passed away in 2015. Her position in life is now relatively well known in terms of her employer. She worked as a chemist in Southampton, a pharmacy, for 50 years. The last 10 of her years was working under the people that bought the pharmacy from her previous employer. And her boss was someone called Usha Sunak. And Usha Sunak's son went on to be the Prime Minister.
Yes.
He regularly would talk about his time living in Southampton, where he's from, and the time helping his mother do the payrolls, etc., at the chemist. So, you know what the funny thing is, if I saw Mum now again, or when I do see her again, I'm not quite sure what I want to say to her first. Hey, Mum, I love you, or hey, you'll never believe what happened to Rishi.
Yeah, isn't that amazing? What a small world. And speaking of a small world, you were involved in a massive scandal by Petrobras. And let's talk about how you got there. You were a lawyer, correct? You got your training, you went to school, and you, do they call it over there a barrister?
No, it's technically a solicitor, but the generic word of lawyer is what I generally go by.
Yes, and you obviously had some series of jobs before you started working for Petrobras, right?
So I worked for a contractor of Petrobras, a company called SBM Offshore.
And what did you do in that capacity, Jonathan?
So I worked ultimately as their deputy general counsel. I started with them in 2003, ultimately left in 2012. By the time I left, I was negotiating most of their major contracts. So SBM are best known for the leasing of something called FPSOs, floating production, storage and offloading units. These are very large vessels that are moored permanently over oil and gas sites under the seabed, so offshore oil and gas reserves, where they're so deep, typical means rigs would not work. So they have things called risers, which connect the well on the surface of the seabed to the vessel, and hydrocarbons go up the risers, and they are ultimately processed. So the carbon dioxide and the sulfur and the water and others are then taken out of the hydrocarbons, and the oil is stored in the hull, often up to 2 million barrels worth. And then shuttle tankers come back and forth and take the oil away to refineries. So these FPSOs are typically chartered by oil majors, mid-sized, mid-cap firms, and national oil companies. And they lease for between $500,000 and $1 million a day. And often the leases continue for 25 years plus. So there's an enormous amount of money in these leases. So FPSO would fabricate these vessels, and they would also operate and maintain them during their lifespan. So huge money involved in the exploration of oil and gas offshore. And ultimately, SBM is the leader, the market leader in what it does. And I was the one negotiating most of the larger contracts for the leases on the one hand, and for the operation and maintenance on the other.
Wow, big job. Big job. So tell us, where is SBM Offshore? Where's it headquartered? Or is it an international company?
So nowadays, its main or head office is in Amsterdam, being obviously the capital of the Netherlands. It is a listed company on the Dutch stock exchange. I think it's now a member of what they call the AEX 25, so one of the top 25 Dutch listed companies. So it's a public company in which anyone can buy shares in.
Got you. So it's a major actor in the oil business, correct?
Right. So it's definitely a household name to most, but it's one of the largest international contractors in the oil and gas industry. So typically BP, Exxon, Chevron, Petrobras, Sonangol, National Oil and Gas Company of Angola, and others. The big names in the oil and gas industry, the big international super majors and the major national oil and gas companies typically would lease or form joint ventures to lease SBMs, FPSOs. So
Gotcha.
at the moment they lease quite a number of units to Exxon offshore Guyana. In the past, and certainly currently, offshore Brazil, also offshore Angola, offshore Equatorial Guinea, offshore Malaysia. Where there are deep oil and gas reserves, SBM is the go-to partner, the go-to contractor for these companies.
So you were a lawyer for SBM Offshore.
That's right. So I started life in private practice and qualified into a firm called Denton's, which is now the world's largest law firm by headcount. I had experience working in-house on secondment with them at Shell in London. I also worked for them, Denton's, in Cairo, Egypt, and in Muscat in Oman. So I got a flavour for working in the oil and gas industry and working overseas and working in-house. And one day I thought, why don't I combine all three? And I got this job with SBM, who were then, their main office was in Monaco. So I left Muscat with my young family, and we started a new life in Monaco.
And you were married. And how many children did you have when you started this venture?
When I started this venture, I had two, and then one came along about 18 months into the new position.
So, in order to get this really straight, you sound like you were a high-power lawyer working for an international company. I assume they paid you well. You had the experience of working internationally, which has to be exciting. And so you were happy in your job, correct me if I'm wrong, getting paid well.
So, yeah, yes to all those statements.
Okay. What happened that made you a whistleblower?
So someone had to be the market leader in their field. I had no reason to believe that SBM were just very good at what they did, and had no reason to believe that the payment of bribes was the key to their success. It was the bastion to their marketing, if you will, to their very existence. Then one day, 31st of January 2012, so eight years after I'd begun there, my general counsel, so the person I reported to, had a call from a US law firm called Wilkie Farr. He knew Jay, the lawyer that rang up, from a previous experience with him working for SBM for another client, for Exxon. This time he was working for a client called Noble Energy, another mid-sized US oil company. And it turned out that he or his client had reason to suspect that SBM had been making bribes through its agent, someone called Hani Taguer, which was quite odd because Hani Taguer had been the head of sales and marketing at SBM and had retired about 3 to 4 years previously. So we were totally in the dark in the knowledge that Hani still had a role at SBM. Turns out the day after he retired, he signed up to an agency agreement under which most, at least non-Brazilian bribes, were executed by this individual. We didn't have a clue about this at the time until this sluice gate moment on the 31st of January. Suddenly, in a very, very short period of time between us, we got to learn about how the company was really run. And so it was top-down corruption. So the members of the board were actively not more than encouraging, actually signing up to certain of the agreements under which bribes were paid. It was something that they were very more than aware of, that they were controlling, and the people that were aware of this was the entire sales and marketing team, some of the people in accounts, and senior management. So you're either on the inside or you weren't. Turns out what Hani was doing, he inherited from a previous director at SBM, and he was the fourth in line. So normally either directors or very senior personnel would retire from SBM and become its agent. And it was something, as I said, gone back over 25 years, and he was the agent of the day at the time of this occurring. So the bribes related to monies being paid to Gabriel Obiang, who was the second son, still is, of the president of Equatorial Guinea, President Obiang, and his second son was the Minister of Oil and Gas, and his hands were being greased, or palms being greased, with the amount of $7 million to ensure that SBM became the contractor on this concession, this offshore concession that Noble Energy had won, because invariably you have to go through the pertinent minister with any major decision in relation to how a concession is operated. So Mr. Obiang and others, but mainly him, he was the main recipient of bribes, were bribed to ensure that contract was duly won. Significantly, a few days later, the official head office in Mali, which is a canton in Switzerland, not the country in Africa, where there were 22 bean pushers or bean counters, the cost controller decided to give us in legal a list, and it was about 20 pages of fine print, and it was entitled Agency Payments, and it dated back 5 years previously, and under that, over $250 million in bribes were listed to a whole host of recipients, the majority of which were Brazilian and Angolan. And as time wore on, I was able to work out under which agreements, not always, but most of the time under which agreements these were paid, because I then became privy to these various agency agreements. And yeah, I was in shock, to put the point mildly, how much the company had paid and how, as I say, it was the bastion to its very existence, and it was in the fibre, the DNA of the company was the payment of bribes to win business.
Wow. So you were totally unaware of this until this agent provided you with this list? Is that how it went?
The list came from the cost controller in Mali. So he was an SBM employee. It was almost as if it was like a come to Jesus moment. He wanted this office back, and now he saw the opportunity because he obviously understood what was going on. He was pressing the buttons to ensure the transfer of money invariably via Swiss bank accounts. And it's almost as if, I mean, I'll never know, but it's almost as if he just wanted that moment. He was waiting for that moment to come clean and tell us in legal, it's probably one of the more senior people within the company that simply didn't know, or that I slowly came to know, quickly came to know, and that was the moment. The sluice skate moment had arrived, and yeah, I never looked back, as it were.
So I have to ask you, do you think most oil companies operate this way? I mean, that is a massive amount of money they were pushing out for bribes. Did they have
So,
to beat somebody else out in order to get the contract? Is that
to,
how
to,
it works?
to answer that question, it would be a huge generalization, but certainly in the past, it's probably fair to say that the payment of bribes in the oil and gas industry were absolutely commonplace. So bear in mind, SBM before its move to Monaco was in Switzerland. And when it started off in Switzerland, the payment of bribes was actually tax deductible. That's how totally acceptable it was. So I'm insinuating that probably bribes aren't quite as regular as they used to be. I'd be naive in saying that they don't exist anymore, but certainly I think SBM was probably one of the more extreme cases. So the idea was that money was predominantly paid for most of the bribes to government officials high up in oil and gas ministries that ultimately had a say-so or a veto in the decisions that counted, including what company should win that particular bid to have an FPSO leased for a quarter of a century at $1 million a day or whatever. And so various methods were used, but the bribes ultimately were paid to reach that end goal by ensuring that the price that SBM would offer won the bid, or the provision of information from other bidders to ensure that SBM underbid them. A whole manner of methods were used, or changing the spec that bidders had to meet in order to have a successful bid, to ensure that certain could be expelled from the process by not meeting the spec, or the changed spec. All sorts of manners were adopted, but hell, SBM succeeded very, very well. In Brazil alone, it won, I think it was something like $24 billion worth at one point of revenue as a result of the amount of bribes it paid going through the whole lease periods. Remember, these are the last 20 plus years. And so you could look back and say with some accuracy that the payment of bribes at the time was an extremely successful business plan, and SBM were head and shoulders above its rivals.
Wow.
Now, the fact that the payment of bribes actually is not a victimless crime, which people like to forget, is brushed under the carpet. Let me give you two examples. So, in Angola or Equatorial Guinea, certain kleptocrats were enriched by many millions of dollars, where in countries where people were ergo kept under the poverty line. I mean, free-flowing water is still a rarity in the provinces, in the countryside, if you will, in places like Angola. They don't have latrines at school. Doesn't work like that. Basic infrastructure is simply not in place. Whilst these kleptocrats cream off money by the provision of bribes, undercutting and undermining totally competition, and the people suffer. You've got President Obiang of Equatorial Guinea buying Michael Jackson's gloves, and the likes. Again, people are suffering as a result of this money being diverted. And likewise, one of the parties that SBM bribed was the Workers' Party in Brazil. And think about that. Brazil, I think, is the fourth largest democracy. SBM were illicitly paying bribes so that President Lula won his second term in office when he was originally in office. I know he's back in office now, but this was a few years back. And in so doing was undermining the very practice of democracy. Those are just two examples of what the payment of bribes can lead to.
Wow. And Jonathan, you were sitting there in this, getting paid well, looking good. And here this is dropped into your lap. And you weren't the only one, I'm sure, that found out what was going on, but you were the one that stepped forward. So tell us about that decision of yours to become a whistleblower. Did you even know that's what you were becoming? What did you do after this was dropped in your lap?
So this ad hoc committee was set up, of which Jay and myself and a few others were party to. And it was the object of which was to discover and investigate what was going on, which is kind of weird if you think about it, bearing in mind that those that actually instructed us to form this committee were right at the heart of what was going on. And then within days, the seeds of cover-up had been sown, and for example, the COO of the day was seen shredding any number of documents. He now occupied the office that Hani Taguer, chief sales and marketing turn agent, had occupied. Jay was being bullied by the supervisory board. So this is the board above this ad hoc board above the management board, into not going after certain individuals, not investigating Angola. He ultimately resigned himself in the April. Going to work was like crossing the trenches during World War I for me. You didn't quite know where to look, because again, you were always answering and dealing with senior management who, as I became aware, knew exactly what was going on. And I began recording meetings. To a large degree, it was about self-protection, because I understood the enormity of what was going on, the enormity of the US companies that we're dealing with ultimately here, not exclusively, but certainly predominantly. And I certainly didn't want to be associated with these crimes by being associated with the knowledge of what had gone on, and trying to cover up. Ultimately, a new lawyer was brought in from the international law firm Allen and Overy at board level, a chief governance and compliance officer, and he brought up a new word, also begins with C, but not cover up, but it means basically exactly the same: containment. He decided the policy of containment should be pursued. If he had had his way, the whole matter would have begun and ended at the Equatorial Guinea level, about which the call was received, and gone no further. My immediate reaction was, well, I had to report to someone. Obviously, you won't be surprised to hear there was no hotline, there was no compliance department, there was no employee handbook in relation to the whole topic of compliance at SBM. There was no one I could turn to and relieve myself of the burden of information I'd received and got on with my career. So I turned, having procured a US attorney, to the Security and Exchange Commission. So that's the body that basically regulates the New York Stock Exchange. It was not so much in the expectation of any kind of reward, as much as anything else, SBM, as I've explained, is listed on the Dutch Stock Exchange. It had dealt with ADRs, American Depository Receipts, on the New York Stock Exchange a few years earlier. I just wanted to offload and give a party, not at that time a prosecutor, all the information I had in order for it to determine what it wanted to do with it. Now, obviously, in witnessing the bribes and procuring the information I did, which was now flooding my way, and I was scanning these documents almost as soon as I got them, and they ultimately went to the SEC via my US attorney, they would have seen the counterparts of the bribes. They would have seen that Petrobras, which is the national oil and gas company of Brazil, and at one point was the largest company in the southern hemisphere by market capitalization, it would have seen that Petrobras was the recipient of over $110 million of these bribes. Remember, this was only going back 5 years. It was a lot more if you went back even further. And so they would have seen that something was wrong with Petrobras. If you just pause there and take a step back, the Dodd Frank Act, which I'm sure you're aware of, and your listeners are aware of, one of the main purposes of that was to overcome the Madoff affair, whereby people should be welcome to come forward and inform the SEC of information that it should know and act on. Ultimately, Petrobras lost $200 billion in value as things came out about the corruption at Petrobras. But with the information I provided, which was, if you like, the first domino that was pushed, the SEC decided it didn't have jurisdiction. You may want to go to the DOJ, leave it to you. So the SEC, this for me is as big as a scandal as anything else in this epic. The fact the SEC did nothing and shareholders in Petrobras suffered as a result of that, and the calamitous drop in Petrobras' share price. Ultimately, what happened in Brazil, thanks to my providing information to the public prosecutor in Brazil, to 10 members of parliament that came over to effectively commission a parliamentary commission in the UK and ask me questions, and other Brazilian bodies, was the beginning of something called Lava-Jato, which was something set up in Brazil investigating corruption at Petrobras. It turns out, surprise, surprise, SBM was just the tip of the iceberg. There were cartels set up with Brazilian engineering companies where they take turns in winning contracts with Petrobras. So Petrobras were being paid, executives were being paying an enormous amount of money. Ultimately, thousands of arrests followed and imprisonments. And Dilma Rousseff, who became the president of Brazil, previously was the Minister of Oil and Gas and the chairperson of Petrobras. And my information ultimately led, or was a major part of her being led to being impeached, and because she was either knew exactly what was going on and allowed it to go on, or she didn't have a clue, which, well, either way, she didn't seem to be fit to be the president, and ultimately was forced to step down. I had no idea that this would be a repercussion of my ultimately going public in a separate way later, after the SEC decided not to do anything.
Jonathan, let me ask you, you're very familiar with Dodd Frank, it sounds like, and you're very familiar with the SEC. Back then, did they offer the rewards like they do now? You read about these incredible
it's crucial
amounts.
To understand. Yeah. It's crucial to understand. The main reason I went to the SEC was to get this off my back. I wanted to share the information I'd gained before I had my neck pulled by a law enforcement agent saying, Taylor, you knew about this, you did nothing.
Right.
Around the same time, the New York Times did a long, extensive investigation into a company called Walmart, a big supermarket, grocery chain in the US, of course, who were paying bribes in Mexico to win planning permission. And I noticed that if you ever see the article, it was concentrating very much on what in-house and instructed lawyers did in relation to holding that. But the fear of God in me encouraged me to continue
Oh,
feeding the SEC with information. Ultimately, nothing happened. The new guy I told you about had come in above me, and he was hell bent on containment, i.e., cover up, and I couldn't continue at the company. Given this policy was simply one of dishonesty, and ultimately I resigned on what was June the 6th, 2012. So 5 months or so after my learning about the real SBM and the way it won its business.
but Jonathan, back then, you're talking about 2012, correct? When you
Yeah.
obviously, okay. The SEC wasn't providing these massive awards like they're doing now.
No,
When
it was all about jurisdiction. It was all about the nets. Their net was far smaller than, say, the DOJ, and SBM simply weren't within their net. They weren't listed on the New York Stock Exchange. They didn't have a strong enough connection for the SEC to offer potentially some award under the Dodd Frank Act. It was as simple as that, and the focus, of course, was on SBM. At the time, this all happened really quickly. I was barely able to understand at first sight what I was
right,
sending over because it was all information gathering at such a quick pace. But they
right.
simply determined they didn't have jurisdiction.
And
So
so did they turn everything over to DOJ?
no, they said they offered you might want to do that yourself. No, is the
Oh,
answer. The adroit answer to that question was no.
so what did you do next
So
when they turned you down?
I thought I'd done enough, and to be really honest now, with the benefit of hindsight, I should have hung up my whistle, hung up my boots, whatever you hang up there and
Yes,
then, because what happened thereafter
right.
um, ultimately caused to a point the ruination of my life.
Yes, and
Um,
let's address that because it has been like a nuclear bomb in your life. I mean, it has ruined an honest person, a hero. It has ruined your life. Hi, we'll be right back with more of Whistleblower of the Week after a quick message from one of our whistleblower friends. Don't go anywhere.
Hey, this is Austin Handel, also known as Officer Ash on social media and as the Dunwoody Whistleblower, and the Vice Chair of the Lamplighter Project. Leading whistleblower attorney Stephen Cohn's latest book, Rules for Whistleblowers, a handbook for doing what's right, is the ultimate guide to blowing the whistle. Rules for Whistleblowers is an easy to read, essential tool for anyone curious about whistleblowing. The book lays out 35 rules to help whistleblowers navigate the complex and dangerous world of whistleblowing. Subscribers to the Whistleblower News Network can also receive 35% off a copy of this indispensable resource. Visit whistleblowersblog.org/rules for whistleblowers to learn more.
so what happened was the said chief compliance and governance officer got in touch with me. What is 9 months later now, March 2013. He wrongly accused me of meeting at a Singapore bar and telling individuals about SBM's corrupt history, which was contrary to the NDA or confidentiality provisions under which I signed up to when I left the company under this mutual termination agreement. That rubbed me up the wrong way. I should never have even answered that email. To cut a very long story short, ultimately negotiations were begun over a period of 14 months in relation to potential compensation for me because my career had really suffered by now. I
Yes.
couldn't answer the question, well, why did you leave the palm-lined streets of Monaco and Monte Carlo
Yes.
with
Yes.
3 children and a wife without a job to go to, Mr. Taylor, when I was going for job interviews? And I couldn't tell them. And so my career was going nowhere. I was now doing a contracting job in Perth, Australia. Um, my career had probably gone back about 15 to 20 years. And ultimately, this 14-month process went on. came to nothing. Benefit of hindsight, they were simply, it was simply a fishing expedition to find out what I knew, so they could determine what they were going to tell the authorities. They had voluntarily gone to the Dutch prosecutor, and they'd voluntarily gone to the Department of Justice in the States. That came to nothing. Ultimately, I was now reading the press releases of SBM, basically denying literally any corruption in Brazil, how Petrobras had undergone a 30-day internal investigation at the same time as SBM, and they both determined that there was no wrongdoing. They ultimately decided that the payment of Julio Fairman, an octogenarian who was SBM's Brazilian agent, who also acted for GE and Rolls-Royce and the like, was just being paid what was 110 million for doing a very good job when SBM didn't have so many people on the ground in Brazil. Ultimately, I'd had enough. I had all these recordings. I knew so much information. I decided to download it all on Wikipedia, SBM's Wikipedia page. I literally loaded about a summary in 9 A4 sheets of work, and it literally, after about the count of 3, disappeared off the page. I thought that was the end of the matter. I didn't understand how Wikipedia works, and they can take things down and research and determine whether they should stay up, and then they can put them back up. And I didn't know that Wikipedia has a history tab. And to this day, you can go back to October 2013 and find my original entry. I think it was the 17th, for all to see. Somehow, somewhere, a journalist picked this up, and in the January following year, so now 2014, one thing led to another, and it was realized that I was the person that put this up and out there, and then the press from particularly Brazil and the Netherlands were after me. Ultimately, my late mother was rung up, and she, not knowing any better, gave a Brazilian journalist my telephone number. Ultimately, I interviewed with them, and that led to, as I say, the beginning of Lava Jetto. I became Mr. Popular throughout the world with prosecutors, so I saw the Brazilian, in no particular order, the Brazilian prosecutor, the Dutch prosecutor, the serious fraud office in London, the Swiss prosecutor, the French prosecutor, the FBI and the DOJ. I went over to Washington, and they would come and see me. Ultimately, through my efforts, over $840 million was rendered in settlements and fines by those various agencies against SBM. 2 of its former CEOs were imprisoned, as were other salespeople. So as whistleblowers go, albeit slightly incidental in the manner the information got out there, it was hugely successful. I'm probably one of the most successful corporate whistleblowers of the century in terms of results. But yes, from a personal perspective, I've paid way too much.
So they got, those municipalities, those governments got this incredible amount of money.
Yeah, thanks to my information. Because they would just go along to SBM and say, look, we've got this. You know, do you want to continue to talk? Or should we just get on with this and sign this settlement agreement right here? Because they had literally next to nothing to do as far as investigation was concerned, because I gave them everything.
Right. So you were the hero. You really were.
I was their hero. I didn't exactly get that. I wasn't chased through the streets on people's arms and shoulders.
Right.
But I was absolutely the hero of all those government and prosecution agencies in making their lives so easy.
So easy. Easy.
For example, the fine in the Netherlands was $250 million. That was enough to bankroll their Ministry of Justice for a whole year.
Wow.
$248 million to the Department of Justice. $399 million to Brazil. it goes on. So I
So
did these
they
guys
should
a
have,
lot of favors.
Jonathan, they should have had you in the streets on their shoulders parading you around. But tell us what happened, because this
So
becomes a nightmare. Yeah.
I made mention of negotiations that had started with SBM. Literally, it turned into meetings. They actually paid for a Monegasque lawyer to represent me. And there were meetings spread over for these 14 months, 6 different meetings at least. And I was given to believe that it would end up in some sort of settlement for me after my career had been left in tatters. Little did I know at the time, but in September 2014, they, SBM, whose, by the way, head office or main office changed and went to Amsterdam as part of the settlement with the Openbaar Ministry, which is the name of the Dutch prosecutor. It's because of all this they moved to the Netherlands, but they still have offices in Monaco to this day. They reported me for attempted extortion to the prosecutor in Monaco, who, by the way, had done absolutely and remains having done absolutely nothing against SBM, notwithstanding, as I say, most of the bribes were conjured up and executed 400 meters away in a place called Fontvieille in Monaco. Monaco are very proud of having a blue chip company have its main office there. They celebrated its products, FPSOs, and its stamps. They would go on trade missions with the Prince. Prince Rainier or Albert would go to open a creche. Indeed, whilst all these fines are being paid, so predominantly around sort of 2015 now, 2016, he opened their new offices in the Neptune building in Fontvieille. So there was a very close relationship between what we call the rock, so where the royalty were, and SBM. And so you had this prosecutor advised of this attempted extortion, and nothing really happened. I got a few letters. I said, look, I'd be happy to go to the embassy. Time wore on, and there was a trial in my absence. I still hadn't been charged, by the way, and it was determined, amongst other things, that the case should not go on because of various breaches of the European Convention on Human Rights, including writing to me in a language I understood, and timeliness. So I thought that was I really thought that was the end of the matter, but no, it was able to continue. More letters wanting me to go to Monaco, where obviously I felt like I was going to be in the lion's den, given how the establishments had not gone after Monaco, rather just me, the whistleblower. Then COVID came along, and I proposed again, let's have a Zoom call. It's travel is difficult at the very best, even if I could get onto a plane in the first place. But ultimately, there was no meeting. I should go back now to 2015 before I go on with that. I'll continue with about the prosecution in a moment. 2015, I received a writ for defamation. So this is generally known as a SLAP, a strategic lawsuit against public participation, seeking damages for statements I'd made in public, all of which were true, that SBM had paid over $250 million of bribes in the space of 5 years. It had misled or not kept shareholders up to date, and it had attempted a cover-up. Fortunately, I found legal counsel in the Netherlands who represented me. We filed a defense with 148 exhibits, and that went away. But it certainly had its chilling effect on me for a while. You know, these are normally issued by rich oligarchs against journalists, not necessarily the company they work for, to shut them up, regardless of the fact that there was no substance or truth in what are vexatious cases. And they, even before it was served, they got an interim order to have a freezing order over my house. They tried to freeze my bank account in Rotterdam, which is very much a trading city, and they're very used to getting these sorts of orders. And yeah, I imagine that was bad enough, but fortunately, the matter went away after the full defense was filed. Now let's go back to the prosecution. I went to Dubrovnik with my family in between lockdowns. So this was now July 30th, 2020. And I was arrested as soon as I arrived, before I even got to passport control, under an Interpol red notice. So this is normally the preserve of war criminals, drugs barons, serious, violent murderers, paedophiles, and the like, the worst of society. But no, they somehow managed to get Interpol involved in the first place by lying that I had been charged. I was never charged, still haven't been charged. And I was
What did they base
arrested.
it on, Jonathan?
So the
What did they base the
box
arrest
they had
warrant
to tick, the box they had to tick. So you have to tick a box, which is closest to the allegation was bribery and corruption.
You did bribery and corruption?
That was the box they ticked. So I think the idea is there's only a limited amount of boxes they have to tick, and this
Wow.
was determined to be bribery and corruption. So Interpol, they had been lied to. They should have, as they do, weed out about 5% of the applicants. So this is obviously Monaco had applied for this arrest warrant. They should have Googled me and found out who they were and realised that this is really a political move more than anything else. But no. And then the next, I've spent 5 days in jail in Dubrovnik, and then I was under house arrest for a year, less 2 weeks. 6 courts dealt with my case: the county court to the Supreme Court in Zagreb, and it went back and forth. Not like the US or the UK, where the court gets higher and higher, and you appeal and get higher and higher. They went back and forth, so it took forever. Also, on a third time of asking, the Supreme Court decided I should be extradited to Monaco. Ultimately, the Minister of Justice, Ivan Malincia, of Croatia, who normally rubber stamps these things, that's what they normally do, Minister of Justices, having their legal system, having determined how the matter should go, he decided, of course, I shouldn't be extradited, and I was set free. And came back, obviously, to the UK. By now, my marriage was over, my career was over. And really, ever since then, I've had to take each day as it came. The case was already had attracted a lot of publicity, as I say, in particular the Netherlands and Brazil. But now the matter is being debated in the Houses of Parliament in the UK. And so got wall-to-wall coverage in Croatia, a huge amount of coverage here on television, radio, newspapers. So now the story was even better known than it already had been. But for aspiring whistleblowers or potential whistleblowers, as things stand at the moment, to the extent they know about my case, I can't imagine how that they would be particularly encouraged, given how obviously I've been treated. It's not a good ending. Should the story end anytime soon?
No. So they made a criminal complaint against you, SBM Offshore.
Right, and
they accused you of what they were doing, saying that,
the complaint was for attempted extortion, even though, of course, lawyers were instructed to try and negotiate a compensation for me.
Right.
What happened was the very famous French barrister, William Bourdon, he acted for Ed Snowden and Pinto and a number of well-known whistleblowers. He negotiated with the examining judge, the investigating judge in Monaco, just the way things happen there, the civil jurisdiction. The investigating judge has to determine whether someone should be charged. He negotiated a way out in December of 2020. So my marriage was still intact. I still had a career. My employers offered me a place back if I could only get back by Christmas.
Okay.
On the 17th of December, to meet with the investigating judge, Ludovic Leclerc, which is exactly where I would have ended up had I been extradited. Okay? But the prosecutor, so I was promised an interview, possibly a second interview, to stick around Monaco, and I'd be free to go back to the UK for Christmas. The Monegasque prosecutor determined that protocol would not be followed, whereby the country seeking extradition has to withdraw the request for extradition in order for me to leave the country. She decided that that shouldn't happen out of pure spite, as far as I could tell. And so that meeting that Bordon had sorted for me never occurred. I packed my bags. I was really excited. I figured I'm coming home. And alas, it wasn't until July the following year that I was released. But by then, all the damage had been done.
Yes.
That was a pretty spiteful act. Ultimately, I went to see the judge voluntarily, the investigating judge, in what was October 2021. So this was 3 months after I'd been released to go back to the UK. I spoke with him for about 7 hours with Bordon. He determined now in April the following year, so we're now April 2022, that Taylor had no case to answer. So remember, I'd never been charged for all this time, and hell, I didn't even have a case to answer. Of course, that prosecutor appealed the decision, probably, I don't know that, at the orders of the man on the rock. And the case was heard in October 2022. And ultimately, the decision was that on appeal, they agreed, they upheld, the Criminal Court of Appeal in Monaco upheld the decision of the investigating judge and agreed that Taylor had no case to answer. So let's think about this. I've raised almost $1 billion in fines for about 6 prosecutors, plus a few regulators in Amsterdam. I've caused the imprisonment of a number of the wrongdoers. I was the person, again, pressed probably one of the first dominoes that led to Operation Lavogetto, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. It was pretty damn effective. But yeah, where have I gone? What have I gained?
Exactly.
What have I gained
Let's
from
talk
it?
about that. Let's talk about that. You did the right thing. You blew the whistle
Bloody effectively.
very effectively. You caused change in the world.
Yep.
You caused active change in the world. And tell us where you're at now. Your wife left you.
I was wrung out to dry, and I was happy with
Yes.
that, like a wet towel. I was wrung out to dry, and then I was wrung for all the information, and then put out to dry by these prosecutors, none of whom
helped you.
At my time
None of them.
need. I was just stuck in Croatia. Oh, my government was saying, oh, we don't want to get involved in the legal process of a third-party country, as we wouldn't want them to get involved in our legal system. So where am I now? I've obviously not been able to get back to my career. Not a straightforward life. A 14-month divorce ensued after I got back to the UK. So it wasn't exactly honey and milk that I came back to.
No.
Ultimately now, having voluntarily lived in Croatia, I think they call it the Stockholm syndrome, up until the summer of this year, I've now moved back to the UK. But obviously, yeah, I mean, I'm obviously struggling when it comes to income, and it's not a straightforward existence at all. What I referred to earlier was that really the benefit of hindsight should have just hung up the whistle with the SEC and not gone any further. I'd achieved what I wanted to in terms of marking a third party's card. Should anything have then happened in the future, I could have said, well, look, I gave everything, and I told everything to the US Securities and Exchange Commission. I think that would have probably been enough and convincing enough, and they obviously would have approved through my lawyer, even though it was an anonymous tip, as it were, as they all are, that it was true. But with the benefit of hindsight, I shouldn't have gone. I took it all rather personally, and I should not have gone any further. I should have ignored that email from SBM back in March 2013 and got on with my life. I would have still been gainfully employed now. I'd still be married now. I'd have a happy family life. That's, with the benefit of hindsight, the mistake I made. I was too good at what I did, but the price was too high.
Yes. Yes, it was. Did you even get a letter of appreciation from anybody?
Good question. No, the
No.
Brazilians, to their credit, in the indictment the Brazilians issued, they recognised me in terms of what I had told them. Because if they'd had their way, of course, if SBM had their way, they would never have been contacted. They recognised the lack of information or provision of information, even by the Dutch authorities to the Brazilian authorities. So they were able to confirm a lot of what I had told them in terms of lack of information going their way, and how SBM had indeed tried to cover matters up. Always remember what became of the instructions through Paul Hastings, another US law firm, to the Department of Justice in the United States was in November 2014, all these years. SBM were able to put out a public statement saying, right, we've been fined by the Dutch 250 million, we're moving our offices to Amsterdam, and hey, the DOJ has looked at the matter, they've decided they don't have jurisdiction. Such was the excellent job Paul Hastings, well done, had done in persuading the DOJ as such. Of course, I was first thing in the new year, I think it was February, straight over to the Serious Fraud Office in London. They invited the FBI. I told them, the FBI now and SFO representatives gave them probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 binders worth, maybe slightly less, of information. And hey presto, the DOJ reopened their investigation and ultimately fined and imprisoned various individuals, fined 248 million, and a agreement was met, a non-prosecution agreement, a deferral agreement, sorry, with SBM. But hell, I mean, that's the extent I helped the US. They had been misled. I've heard from DOJ representatives since all of this that they were ultimately misled. They weren't told the full picture, and they ultimately determined there was no case for SBM to answer until I came along. And no thanks whatsoever. Of course, I reached out to the various prosecutors to see what help they could give me, but no, nothing was forthcoming. Even the Dutch, after the Dutch had found out formally that bribes were paid to Brazil after the SBM said they weren't, they were still allowing, because they told me that important information, they were still allowing the then CEO Bruno Chabas to go around the world to say that there were no bribes paid to Brazil. They allowed that to happen after they had been told. So you got to be very wary of these prosecutors, because they don't exist for in my case the whistleblowers' well-being at all. They exist in certainly from my experience for the easiest life as possible. How can we utilize this information that Taylor's provided us with for our benefit and blow Taylor?
Yeah. It's just horrifying. It's horrifying. And you've been blackballed, right, in your industry?
Well, yeah, because I mean, obviously, I'm as in certainly whistleblowing circles, at the very least, I'm very well known, and a Google of my name with Croatia or the Netherlands or Brazil or SBM, there's hundreds of thousands of pages out there on me, and yeah, and people go through the smallest of checks, and you've got to explain what you've been doing for the last few years. So it's obviously impossible for me to get away from what I've done, and no, I can't get back on the job ladder whatsoever. No.
So what advice, this is a loaded question, Jonathan, and I hate even to ask you, but what advice would you give other whistleblowers at this point?
Yeah, really, the best answer I can give you is there's a company also. It existed just to pay bribes. It's called Unoil, and it was based in Monaco. And they were paying bribes for at least 12 US corporations, and the whistle was blown on Unoil. It was again a Monaco company led by some Iranian Brits, and ultimately the whistleblower is so good at keeping his or her self anonymous, we don't even know what sex she is. And he or she, or they is, will be benefiting hugely from the SEC. So one by one, basically US companies are using unit oil to pay bribes, are being fined enormous amounts of money, as the SEC does and the DOJ does. And he or she did such a good job. To this day, he or she has remained anonymous. So if you're going to be a whistleblower, I can't even say go and see her or him because we don't even know who she is. But look at the unit oil case. Look how they are exposed. Fairfax Media in Australia. Incidentally, 18 months after I'd identified unit oil in that Wikipedia leak, I'd identified unit oil, but the money was only about 5 million. SBM had used unit oil to pay bribes in Kazakhstan, in Iraq, and in Italy. But it was like in the small print. Whilst the prosecutors had they printed out that page, knew all about it. Yeah, they had that. It was such a small amount. They didn't focus on unit oil. So the whistleblower in the unit oil case got all the glory for exposing unit oil, which I'd already exposed 18 months before. But hell, so
Wow.
what? So what's my answer to you is, yeah, look at that person and how well he or she's done. You have to protect yourself so well. You have to be very wary when dealing with your authorities. Probably speak to another whistleblower before doing anything. You have to be so conscious that people aren't necessarily, the organizations you're reporting to aren't there to look after you. They're there to meet their own ends, which is quite different to looking after you. And you have to be so aware of that and tread very cautiously. And it's not for the light-hearted. There are fools in my mind that rely upon these payouts that are offered under the Dodd Frank Act. But my serious and sincere views on that is, I think the most recent figures are for last year. 1/3 of 1% of the thousands of tips there were received compensation. I hate to think what those people who went to the SEC under the Dodd Franks through their US attorneys were expecting, and how their lives may have been turned upside down by something. You've got, okay, a slightly worse chance of winning the lottery, but it's still a very, very small chance of procuring any kind of compensation. Honestly, people should look at the protection of whistleblowers. The compensation is so relatively secondary, and I fear that people are motivated by Dodd-Franks to blow the whistle at huge, enormous personal cost.
Yes. Yes. Last question, Jonathan. I admire you so much, but the fact that you are a hero, the fact that you are a person of integrity, the fact you are a person of conscience and courage, does that make a difference in terms of what you did? I mean, you are a hero, and time will reveal that.
So, of course, it's nice for that to be recognized. Of course, I'm not going to say, oh, I hate to, or wish you hadn't said that. And of course not. But at the same time, I can't ignore the position my life is in as a result of said heroics. And I repeat, the price I paid was way, way too much for what occurred and for what I did. And it's a reflection on how really that the world is probably not ready from a legal perspective for whistleblowers. There should be solid, robust laws in place. My foreign secretary at the time, Dominic Raab, said, because we've been sent various papers from the Foreign Office, we're talking about, I want to help Taylor. This is the foreign secretary. But even he was unable to, such as the lackluster laws that are in place. But there needs to be robust laws on an international basis so there could be more tailors free in the knowledge that they will be protected, won't be subject to slaps, won't be subject to imprisonments, won't be subject to being pursued relentlessly by a prosecutor in Monaco, in my case. That can't be right. There needs to be better protection.
Jonathan Taylor, you're a hero, and I think you're going to be part of that process to change how the world deals with whistleblowers. I thank you. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I think the world needs to thank you.
Thank you for those words. It's good that you understand. You have an insight as to what has gone on and what I've been through. And hell, I'm longing to turn the corner, whatever that corner may be, or whenever it may occur.
Right. Thank you, Jonathan Taylor.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to read more whistleblower stories, go to www.whistleblowersblog.org. Music by Rachel Kilgore. Editing and booking by Anissa Sheikh and Victoria Thompson. And a special thanks to our sponsors, Whistleblower Network News.
Growing up, I think you'll find that it's just as hard to stand up tall as it was when you were small. The truth is hard to say.